maybe I could take a step back and just sort of walk through future studies as a framework,
Mhm.
just sort of lay that foundation for folks, for people who aren't really familiar with it. And you know, I think future studies is, I mean, for those who aren't familiar with it, it came out of really military war games in the 1940s. And so this idea of the Delphi technique was developed by the Rand Corporation in 1953, really for war games initially, and then it was applied to corporate futures, and then financial futures, and organizational futures, and so on. And so, but it really, future studies as an academic field really didn't coalesce until the 1980s, 1990s, with work by Wendell Bell, Jim Dater at University of Hawaii. He's sort of I don't know, one of them's John Lennon, and the other one's Paul McCartney for future studies. So, and then it's sort of taken off from there as a theoretical framework. And so there's a lot to unpack there. And a lot of folks who deal in future studies spend a lot of time in that theoretical framework. And I don't find that particularly helpful for me in thinking through this, but I do like the way that they've come up with, Wendell Bell really has distilled this idea of thinking of possible futures, thinking of multiple futures. You have what's probable, you have what's possible, you have what's preferable, right? There are other versions that you can that folks look at, but I think those three categories are really helpful. So the probable, what do I think is going to happen? Yeah, I think before we get to robot teachers and we have that inequity of access and the continuing gap between rich and poor and middle class in America, I mean, I think we see that happening in higher education, right? So you have elite institutions, liberal arts institutions, Ivy League, and so on. More and more are the ones that for folks who can afford it. And then you have this sort of large middle of institutions, state institutions, land-grant institutions, and so on, that are moving in the direction of workforce development. You know, they're shedding the liberal arts. You know, I mean, the pandemic is sort of laying this bare. And even, I mean, there was an article, I believe in the Chronicle, by someone from Johns Hopkins who was bringing this to light at Johns Hopkins, which is absolutely an elite institution, that there were all these budget cuts. And so now we're going to use the pandemic as an excuse to cut things like liberal arts and so on. And we're going to focus on workforce development. And then that workforce development piece is going to be pushed online more and more. And we see that happening. And then you have sort of the for-profit online world of higher education, which is really there for credentialing more than anything else, right? It's not about a university education. It's not about maybe what, you know, Alex, you and I are probably close to the same age. It's not what our generation was told about the value of a university education, you know? And so we already see that split. We already see that happening. So, you know, in terms of post-pandemic, that's just going to become more stark. So that's going to happen there. That may actually serve as a model for this, you know, when technology begins to really ramp up in terms of its application and its deployment in public education in schools. Yeah, then we may see that modeling what's already happening at the university level. In terms of that I would put under the probable category. What's possible? I think there are a couple of things that are possible, and I'm not sure if they're good or bad. One of them is certainly a complete intrusion of technology into the process. So one possibility could be human teachers sort of go by the wayside, or they're an elite cadre, and then the rest of us are sort of looking for other jobs because we've been replaced by robot teachers. To say nothing of our education students, right, who are going to go out into K-12. It's possible. I think learning platforms and the proliferation of iPads, of hardware and software, and humans may be in the room as teachers, but our judgment and our ability to engage in pedagogy and relationships with students will be replaced by technology. We will be relegated to some sort of tech support, right? As the student engages with that predictive model on that Apple developed software, that adaptive software for those kids. This is already happening. This has been happening in Chicago for the last 4 or 5 years. Leap Innovations is one organization that's been doing that. Rahm Emanuel had made sure that there were these incubators for education, and he offered up large swaths of Chicago public schools as sort of labs for students, largely students of color, largely students in the South Side, low-income neighborhoods, to be guinea pigs, to be beta testing the software for Apple, for Google, for these these companies. So all these things are already kind of happening. I think it's possible that actually then explodes. What would be preferable? I don't know. The United States becomes Denmark. I have the crisis of leisure that John Maynard Keynes wrote about 85 years ago. I work a 15-hour work week. And then school is divorced from workforce development and employment. By the same token, so is healthcare. So, I mean, that would be preferable. Preferable would be, Marx is a Renaissance man. I can wake up in the morning and be a poet. In the afternoon, I can be a firefighter. And in the evening, I can be a carpenter, and the preferable is really about tapping into creativity. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of part of the key to being human, right? Is to be able to engage in creative pursuits. And that element has really been limited, if not entirely erased, from everything we're talking about right now. Forget about in the future. If you look at a typical teacher education program for an undergraduate in this country has very little room for electives or creativity or thinking outside of EdTPA or PPAT or licensure. It's going back to that loss of the liberal arts, so yeah, so in terms of a framework to think of these things, I think future studies gives me that. What future studies in education, I think, is missing is this creative turn. And I think if you read academic articles, if you read policy publications about educational futures that come out of the UN, that come out of UNESCO, that come out of the EU and out of places like the RAND Corporation and so on. Brookings Institute has a number as well. It's not creative. It's about sort of replicating what's happening right now and making it more efficient. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that's actually preferable. And so when I think about future studies in this framework, I think, wait, there's all this other thinking we could be doing. It's that creative thinking. It's not about how we get there. It's not about predicting the future. The Delphi technique is about predicting the future, right? That's what military exercises are for, right? What future studies in education, I think, should be doing is anticipating the future. And that anticipation exists in science fiction in a way that it doesn't exist anywhere else, especially in academic writing. And so that Asimov piece is just one example. And so the iRobot teacher, of course, comes from iRobot. That's the inspiration for it. And the 3 laws of robotics, and then the Zeroth law of robotics that Asimov played with over the years and has been talked about in academic writing. It's been sort of critiqued. It's been held up as an exemplary. It's been used to actually influence and inspire actual technological, AI companies and technological development. People have referred back to those robot laws. And so my question is, why aren't we thinking about that in terms of robot teachers or about these issues of, human teachers, right? Being accessible only to a small group of wealthy students, right? So then what about the ethics behind all this? And really what this is, these are all ethical questions, right? These are questions about what we value. These are questions about, whose interests are being served and who's being left out in these conversations.